not democratic, violate human rights. And so they don't believe that it's ever going to happen. And they fear, more than the mainstream, what? They fear intervention, invasion, occupation, or at the very least, dependency. Is there any empirical basis for thinking about that, starting with European colonialism and moving forward? You know, for having that fear? Think about that, being economically dependent, being militarily dependent, being politically dependent in terms of what will happen. So, when you ask Muslims, what do you resent? Majorities of Muslims say what they resent is what I just said, but also the denigration of Islam and Muslims. The denigration of Islam and Muslims, particularly the notion that Muslim life, Arab and Muslim life, is cheaper than other people's lives. Well, is there a basis to begin to think of that? Now, we have a bright group of students here. I won't expect that you'll know this answer. I always hate when people throw questions out. It's a way of hanging yourself, you know. If you get lucky, somebody knows the answer. Otherwise, it gets really embarrassing. Because you say things like, well, you must know the answer. I used to get that in graduate school. My Muslim professor would say to me, well, what about what St. Paul said in, he studied Christianity, Corinthians 12:2? And I go, uh-huh. How am I supposed to know that? Or he'd say things like, we all know when al-Ghazali died. No one would ever forget that. So I looked at it, 1111 AD. Once you hear it, you don't forget it. But I didn't know it was 1111 AD to begin with. So I'm not going to say this, but for most of us here, we would be pretty sure that we could, in rough numbers, talk about the number of Americans who were killed in Iraq or in Afghanistan. We keep the exact count. We know the number of Americans that are injured. Okay? Have you seen many empirical discussions or many stats put out by our own government on the number of Iraqis who've killed? The number of Iraqis who've been named? The number of Iraqis and children who have been stillborn, or miscarriages, etc., that have occurred because of that? So what I'm trying to say is, you see, one sees the ability to keep certain stats and not the others, and then the question becomes why? You know? Because you're going to see this big disparity in numbers, and someone's going to say, it is horrific that so many Americans were killed in Iraq. But look at the figures for Iraqi deaths. How do you manage to deal with that lack of proportionality without feeling that there are some substantial problems there? Now, all I'm trying to do is not so much make my argument, but to put out for you and to show you that things are not always as we might initially begin to think about. And so, for example, when after 9/11 we said, why do they hate us? And President Bush and others said, they hate us for our democracy, our way of life, our gender equality, ... everything we are. Well, that's true in terms of maybe Muslim extremists, you know. But often the they was seen as anybody who was against American foreign policy. Anybody who was anti-American was put in the same league as those who hate America and want to kill, versus anti-American in the sense that I don't like your policy. Because if anti-Americanism is unacceptable, then we've got to deal with the Japanese and South Africans, we've got to deal with most of Europe. And in terms of getting, again, something that goes counterintuitive, and I want to work in some stuff just so that you see how difficult it's been for us to have a sense of what the reality is versus the conventional wisdom. When you look at what most Muslims identify as the causes of their discontent, of their grievances, they are political and economic, not religious. But religion is used by extremists to then legitimate those grievances. The empirical proof is go back and look at the early speeches of bin Laden. Look at his interview on CNN. A very good first couple of pages. I mean, in terms of kind of, looks like, you know, articulate, logical analysis of grievances that are all political and economic. Because his main goal was to say governments in the region are un-Islamic, illegitimate, we got to overthrow them, and ultimately became the notion of the near enemy and the far enemy. The far enemy were those governments that support the near enemy. But then when he went to legitimate what we need to do and to mobilize, then he appealed to religion. But the fact is, when you actually look at data in terms of, you know, what the drivers are, it's not piety, it's politics, it's political grievances. which is one of the reasons why more and more in the second Bush term and under Obama, they began to talk about, and in Europe, most people talk about the importance of winning the hearts and minds, that this is an ideological war. And indeed, General Shinseki, whom you may remember, was the head of the army, and then was as it were, his moving on in his job was announced a year or two before he actually had to move on, because he was the one that disagreed with Rumsfeld on the number of people we'd have to put in. He's now, as you know, a member of the cabinet, Mr. Obama. General Shinseki once said to me, the military is trained to kill and capture. We're good at that. We're not trained to fight war on global terrorism, because that's about winning minds and hearts. That's about dealing with that part of it. And that's not just public relations, it's foreign policy. And I'll come back to that in a second. It's foreign policy. And unless we're willing to address that. So to say that it's because they hate our freedoms when we're talking about majorities of people in the world, most people in the world admire greater political participation. They may not want to use the word democracy at times because they think that will open the door to an imposition of American and European democracy. But obviously, most people in the Muslim world who live, or many, under authoritarian regimes don't wake up every day and say, oh right, we resent that in America because we prefer what we have. You don't have to deal with elections. And if we have him, we know already he's going to win by 99.1%. So you don't get any agita by watching TV debates every Sunday. You don't worry about whether or not you really, it's a rainy day, should go and vote, or, oh yeah, Muslims have a problem with capitalism. That's right. Because most Muslim families I know wake up and say, thank God if we're in Egypt, most of us are poor. Life's simple. You don't work long hours, you don't worry about the professions, your kids don't have to worry about, parents don't have to worry about tuition to go to school. I mean, this sort of simplistic notion. Gender equality. Major problem in some Muslim countries with inequality. But what does the data show? Majorities of Muslims in virtually every country, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, majorities of Muslims, men and women, believe that women should have equal rights. Equal rights to citizens, to education, to jobs, even holding the senior-most positions. Now, the next question is, why don't they have it? Then you have to look at the nature of the governments. Who's in government? How do they get there? Was it through elections? How do they stay there? Is it through politicking or security forces? And how do they manage to stay there? Who provides them with the military hardware? Who trains their security forces? Who trains their military more often? In order to put that in a context to begin to understand why, rather than say it must be Arab culture and Islam, that's why these countries are underdeveloped. Well, if you look at countries that didn't emerge, most of them until 50 or 60 years ago, and they had about 100 years of European colonialism, European colonizers were not about promoting democracy, in case you haven't figured that out. That wasn't their big thing. Railroads, yes, but not democracy. So if you actually take a look, and then what do they get? You get independence, and most of the people who come in are kings, military and ex-military. Many of them come in with the support of European countries. Remember how the rulers of Iraq and Syria came about, and Jordan. You had two brothers who lost to the Saud family in Saudi Arabia. So, got to do something. Churchill created a new artificial state called Jordan, and made one of them the king of Jordan. And the other brother got second prize. He got Syria. But things didn't work out in Syria. Well, not to worry, we move you to Iraq. You become the king in Iraq. Thus begins the power situation in the region. And it's a power situation that on and off, whether it was the Shah of Iran, or Saddam Hussein, or the rulers of Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, or many countries, supported by, selectively, by a number of Western countries. So that gives you the context for what we're talking about. Let alone then when you move to issues of gender equality, in which you've got more patriarchal societies, you've got governments that are very concerned and are patriarchal themselves, and you've got elites that have their agendas. So all of that has to be put into perspective when one wants to try to understand the dynamics that are now playing out. And in particular, one has to deal with this notion of political grievances and double standards.